Okay, as promised, it's the top of the hour. We're going to get started. Hello and welcome to our webinar on Realtor Flood Insurance Basics. My name is Terry Calvin. I'm with National Flood Services. I also have on the line with me Heidi Keibel. She is our co-host, and Heidi will be manning the chat lines and running our polls and just generally chiming in if she would like to. So I have everyone muted, but we don't want to discourage any questions or comments, so please feel free if you wish to ask questions or make comments by typing them in the chat box, and we'll be sure to address them. So this webinar is going to run right around 45 minutes depending on any questions we may get. And at the end of the week, you'll receive an email that includes a recording of the webinar. You should also know probably that this is for educational purposes only. There is no CE for this, but we hope it will be worth your time. So I wanted to explain that this presentation was actually designed originally for real estate agents, for doing a presentation to real estate agents, but we decided to share it with insurance agents and perhaps give you an idea of what kinds of things you may want to include in presentation materials if you're going to do a talk to real estate agents. I think real estate agents are woefully uninformed about the flood program, so sometimes this goes over well with them if you get a chance to talk to them. So I've actually used this presentation before with groups of real estate agents, and it was received pretty well. So from this point on, I'm going to mainly teach this as if you are real estate agents, so just keep that in mind, okay? All right. This presentation was designed, oh, wait a minute. Heidi, can you go ahead and run our first poll? Almost forgot.
I sure can. In our first poll, we're kind of getting to know you just a little bit. So we're going to ask what your experience is working with realtors. You don't currently work with realtors, but you would like to in the future. Do you get referrals from realtors possibly? Or do you work with realtors often and have been asked to speak at their meetings?
I hear this often from agents that they get invited to come to these things, to be on panels or even to do a presentation. And I encourage you to get in on the meetings because they're always looking for speakers, and this is a good topic. How are we doing?
So we have a pretty good split. We have about 78% who's actually voted. Let me go ahead and publish these so that you can see them.
Okay.
We're relatively evenly split. A lot of our folks out there get referrals from realtors often. Our second runner-up would be that they don't currently work with realtors, but they would like to.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I hope that this will help you and give you some ideas on some things that you may want to talk to agents or real estate agents about. So now I'm going to get into the presentation and imagine that you're real estate agents. This presentation was designed to give you some basics about the flood insurance program. Now, it's tempting to go into a lot of detail. However, we're not trying to turn you into insurance agents. We would just like to touch on some things we believe would be helpful for you to know since your world interacts with the world of insurance on a very regular basis. Let's take a look at our objectives. First of all, this is what we plan on looking on the in the webinar. We'll start with some basics about flood insurance. We'll also look at the rates and what kinds of things about the property and the program affect that rate. After that, we'll present some interesting facts about flood insurance and end up with some takeaways and, of course, some resources for you to use. Let's take a quick look at the birth of the NFIP. The National Flood Insurance Act formed the NFIP in 1968, and flood insurance was available for the first time. In 1973, it was amended by the Flood Disaster Protection Act, which made flood mandatory in special flood hazard areas, which are the high-risk flood areas. So if there's a federally backed loan on there, it became mandatory at that time that they carry flood. In 1979, FEMA was created. Prior to that, the NFIP was under the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And then in 2003, they created Homeland Security and moved it underneath that. Often, I think you and your client think it won't flood here, especially if they've not previously had a flood. But you should know that flooding is the #1 disaster in the United States by far. If you live in a high-risk flood zone, you stand a 26% chance of having a flood compared to a 10% chance of having a fire. In 2007, flooding occurred in all 50 states. 98% of all U.S. counties have had a flooding event at one time or another. That's a lot, I think. The point is, no one can promise you it won't flood here. No one. One important part of any flood insurance policy is the definitions. So we should take a look at the definition of flood, because if it doesn't meet the definition, the loss will not be paid. I hate just reading this stuff, but I think it's important we be very precise about it. So flood is defined as a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land areas, or 2 or more properties, at least one of which is the insured's property. Now notice that it says it's either or, it's not both. So it's either 2 acres or 2 properties. So continuing on, the water can come from the overflow of inland and tidal waters, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. That's your lakes, rivers, and the ocean. Or it can come from the unusual and rapid accumulation of surface waters from any source. Many people think that flooding has to come from a naturally occurring event like rain, but that's just not true. It can be a man-made event like a garbage truck backs over the fire hydrant. So as long as it meets the rest of that definition, that would be a flood. Mud flow is also included in the definition. And I say mud flow, not landslide. Don't confuse the two. The difference is water content. Mud flow is going to have a lot more water in it and be actually a river of flowing mud is how they say it. Okay? You may want to know who can purchase flood insurance. So owners of eligible structures in participating communities can purchase flood insurance. An eligible structure or building is defined as 2 outside rigid walls with a fully secured roof that is affixed to a permanent site. And these would include things like homes, commercial buildings, churches, schools, in addition to condo associations, unit owners in the condos, and of course, buildings in the course of construction. Renters can also buy flood insurance for their contents. These structures would have to be in an eligible and participating community. So when I first started learning flood insurance, I just thought the whole country was in the flood program. I mean, after all, it's a federal program. Doesn't that mean it's for everyone? Well, it turns out that communities do not have to participate in the flood program, and some don't. Every state has communities that do not participate in the flood program for various reasons. And normally these are smaller, less populated communities that have just never really seen a need for a flood program, or perhaps they would have to make some very expensive changes to get in the flood program, like they might have to add drainage or put levees in or something, and they're a poor community. They don't have enough money to spend on that. So, but there are some communities that are not in it, and they cannot buy flood. So when they join the flood program, FEMA, usually with the help of the Corps of Engineers, helps develop their maps. And they draw a line where the base flood elevation is and develop the flood zones. Then they appoint a floodplain manager, develop a plan with building codes that they have to stick to, and then FEMA and the community decide on a start date. And that day when they join the flood program is called the regular program entry date, sometimes always also called their firm date, because that's the date when their flood insurance rate map, or firm, is effective for the first time. So anything built before that date would be pre-firm, before the map, And anything built on or after that date would be post-firm. And it would be subject to all of the rules, the building codes and all of that. Each of those have different rules and sometimes different coverages, so keep that in mind because I'm going to refer to that in a couple of slides. We're going to talk about something else that's affected by that. Okay? In the last slide, I said that the base flood elevation and flood zones are determined, and you'll see that all special flood hazard areas, or what we call SFHAs, are the high-risk zones, and those start with an A or a V, possibly followed by a letter or a number, as you'll see in the slide up there. Now, V stands for velocity. Those will normally be on the beach. So think of those as areas with storm surge. A stands for accumulation, and those are zones that are more often inland, although there could be A zones on the beach. I've seen A zones certainly on the beach, and those would be areas probably with a little less storm surge, even though they are on the beach. Then we have our non-special flood hazard areas, or NSFHAs. Those are your zones B, C, or X, and these are your low to moderate risk zones. The B, C, and X zones would be those where the lender does not normally require the borrower to purchase flood insurance. And they can, it's their option, but it's not required by the federal government, and they usually don't require it. So notice that I didn't ever say no risk, because there are no risk zones. B, C, or X zones both have standard and preferred rates, and a structure may qualify for the lower cost preferred risk policy depending on their loss history. So just be aware that is available. Now, if you look at that picture, you'll see a river right there in the lower left-hand corner. Now, the river and the lower land close to the river, as well as the low-lying area in the top right of the picture, are shaded in blue. You should be able to see that. This has been determined to be an AE zone. So if you'll look at the line between the blue shaded area and the unshaded areas, that would be the base flood elevation. If you're built on land in the shaded area, you're in a high-risk zone called AE. If you're built on land that's unshaded, in other words, higher than the base flood elevation, then you are in a B, C, or X zone and are determined to be a low or moderate risk flood zone. So the height of the land you're built on is the largest factor that determines your zone. The height of the building can help with the price, but it doesn't change your zone. The height of the land you're actually sitting on is what determines the zone. Understand that the line, the base flood elevation, is the line of that base flood elevation there has no wall. There's nothing to stop that water from rising higher than that land, and areas outside that land can and do sometimes flood. So this picture may lead you to believe that you must live near a body of water in order to flood, and that's just not true. There are some low-lying areas that flood and are not necessarily near a body of water. High and dry does count. I mentioned before that the height of the house can help the rates on the insurance policy, so the key is elevating the living space above the base flood elevation. Notice the first house on the left. You can see it is built 4 feet below the base flood elevation, which is essentially saying it's built underwater when it floods. So the price is going to be very high on that. The price showing in the slides are in an AE zone, but are probably actually a little bit lower than the real price, or are assuming a very small house or lower coverage. I took this from a FEMA document, and I think it was a little bit dated. If you were buying the full $250,000 worth of coverage, the price on that house, the one on the left, would be a bit higher, probably closer to $13,000. So if you look at the house in the middle, you'll see that it's built with the living space right at the base flood elevation. That premium's much more reasonable. And again, the full $250,000 would be a little higher, probably close to $2,000. The living floor for the house on the right is built 3 feet above the base flood elevation. Notice how much this helps the rate. The rate for 250,000 would be a little bit higher, probably closer to 550 or 600, but still very, very reasonable. So these scenarios are assuming that the area below the home is either not enclosed, in other words, just on pier and beam, or it's either a slab on grade or they're just on pier and beam. I like to call those sticks in a stairway. I know y'all have seen those on the beach. It's pretty descriptive of that. Or it assumes that the area below the home is enclosed, but it's done to code, because there are codes if you're going to enclose the area underneath an elevated house. In a zone that begins with an A, the enclosure would have to have proper vents and be unfinished. There can't be any living space down in that enclosure. In a V zone, it's a little bit different. They would have to have certified breakaway walls, and the enclosure could only be 299 square feet and be unfinished. Again, no living space there, and if there's an elevator, just throw in a lot of money, because the elevators can really drive up the cost on that, because there's surcharges and things on that. So work with your insurance agents on that about, determining what's below there and what needs to be there, but that just kind of gives you an overall description of what kinds of things affect that rate. So I'm sure that at least one of your clients has been asked for an elevation certificate when talking to their insurance agent. So when would an elevation certificate be required to purchase flood insurance? Remember when I talked about pre-firm and post-firm? I told you I was going to mention it later. So the elevation certificates would be required for post-firm buildings beginning with an A or a V. So in other words, those would be your high-risk zones on buildings that were built after the community's first flood map was effective and they joined the flood program and had all the building regulations. Okay? There are several ways to get an elevation certificate. First and probably easiest way is to talk to the current owner or perhaps the original developer. It's possible they have it and they'll give your client a copy. If they don't have it, you can try calling the community. Some don't collect those at all. They don't maintain copies at all, but some of them do. Just be aware that it may be a recent thing where they started collecting them, and if the house that you have is built well before they started doing that and you need something older, they may not have that. So, but if all else fails, your client may have to pay a surveyor, engineer, or architect to do one for them. Those prices are different depending on what area of the country you're in or where you're, what area of the country you're in. Oh, I just noticed somebody saying I'm cutting in and out. Am I okay? Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me.
Terry, you're clear on you're clear on my end. Okay. Yvonne, you can try to hang up and then dial in again if you need the number. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat line.
Okay, great. All right, anyway, the prices on those vary from place to place. In areas where a lot more elevation certificates are done because there's a lot of flooding in that area, they'll be really cheap. Places like Florida or, New Orleans, or even in Houston, they're fairly reasonable. Houston's where I live. But you get into areas where they don't do as many of them, you're going to find they're a little bit more expensive. So the reason that an elevation certificate is required is determine if those post-firm structures were built in compliance with the floodplain building codes we talked about. So the numbers on the document provide the information needed to correctly rate that property. It shows the base flood elevation, the height of the living floors, information on the enclosures, etc. And we need all of that information to be able to, determine what the rate on that property would be. So I often get asked, are rates different from company to company? And the answer to that should be that if it's an NFIP policy, all rates, rules, and procedures should be the same, whether the policy is written directly through the NFIP or it's written through what we call a WYO company. It should be the same. So WYO stands for Write Your Own. This is a program in which the insurance company can elect to put the NFIP policy on their paper with their name and their logo, their insurance company. The NFIP takes all the premium, they pay all the claims, and then they give a percentage of that premium back to the WYO company in order for them to pay commissions to their insurance agents and offset the cost of processing. And hopefully the insurance company makes a little bit of money off of it. Now, having said that, understand that people can make mistakes. It could be a wrong zone. They could be applying the rules incorrectly. But the fact is that one of them is incorrect because they both should be the same. Also, in recent years, I'll just mention that there's been some private insurance companies that have started coming out with flood programs. The prices for these private companies can be more or they can be less than the NFIP. They sometimes include additional coverages. I really don't want to get into a lot of details about those right now, but just be aware that they're out there. And if you deal with an insurance agent or your client is dealing with an insurance agent, they may talk about that if they have access to one of those private carriers. Oh, it's time for another poll question. Heidi?
Sorry about that, folks. Give me a second here. I kind of lost all my windows all at one time.
Oh, dear.
And they don't want to come back. It's dark out here. Okay, here we are. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. Our poll question 2, testing your knowledge, and I'll tell you that Terry is often tricky when she makes up these poll questions. Can a building owner's policy be transferred to another party? Yes, but only at renewal. No, it can never be transferred to another party, or yes, on or prior to the date of sale of the property.
Answers coming in fast and furious.
Answers are coming in, and they're pretty stilted to one of those answers. I wonder if it's the right one.
I don't know.
We have about 86%. Let's go ahead and end our polling, and I'll let everyone see that. Terry, 81% said yes, on or prior to the date of sale of the property.
Well, that's wonderful because 81% of you are correct. Thank you. So, yes, a building owner's flood policy may be transferred to another party. So something important to know when your client is buying or selling a property is that it can be transferred. Must be done on or before the date of sale, and the seller must sign an endorsement form. Important to note probably that the monies must be handled at closing because this is a transaction between the buyer and the seller. The insurance company will not be involved in refunding or collecting money on this particular transaction. So it's not available for buildings in the course of construction or for contents-only policies. I got a call one time from an insurance agent wanting to know when we were going to refund their guy his money because he had transferred it to another person. And that's got to be handled on your HUD form at the closing table. They'll pay pro rata for whatever's left on the policy. So just be aware of that. All right. Flood maps can and do change. Your client should ask his insurance agent about grandfathering if maps are changing. Grandfathering can be a great cost-saving option because it may allow the client to keep the old base flood elevation level and the old zone after the map changes. Now, they can't technically keep a preferred policy. That's not grandfathered. Only standard rates for those zones would be able to be grandfathered, but there are a couple of other options available for those people too, so they should talk to their agent about that. There's 2 ways to grandfather. Pre-firm, remember that's before they join the flood program, can only be grandfathered using continuous coverage as an option because, remember, they were built before the rules and building codes were in place with which to comply, so they weren't built in compliance with anything. That property would have to show continuous coverage since before the map was changed. Post-firm properties can use that option also, but they have another option called built-in compliance. And that means that if they can prove the property was built in compliance with that base flood elevation, in other words, they were built above that, and the building codes at the and all the other building codes at the time they were built, then they can grandfather that zone and that base flood elevation. But again, they should talk to their insurance agent to determine what kind of proof is necessary for that. 20 to 30% of flood insurance claims originate in the low to moderate risk flood zones. That's the B, C, and X zones we talked about. Think about that. That's a quarter to almost a third of all flood insurance claims to the NFIP are from those zones where people are told, you're not in a flood zone, you'll never flood, you don't need flood insurance. I mean, that seems like a lot. And remember, to have a claim, they actually have to have a policy, and a lot of people in those areas don't even buy policies. So that makes it even worse. You know, people are under the misconception that if they that they have to live in a hurricane zone or next to a river or an ocean or something to flood, and if they don't, or they've never flooded before, then they're not going to flood now, and clearly that's not the case. So let's take a look at some of the causes for flooding, even in the low-risk areas where people think they cannot flood. First, development can cause flooding, and it does not even need to be near you. I've run into cases, believe me. Could be 100 miles north of you. You don't even know it's happening, but somebody's building something. They're laying concrete and preventing absorption of that rain, and it drains into the drainage ditch or the river or whatever that's coming to your area. Inadequate drainage can be an issue. And again, that's usually related to the development. I mean, communities don't start off saying, hey, let's not put any drainage in our area. So they start off with what they think is proper, but over time with development, it sometimes becomes inadequate. Abnormal rainfall amounts. Iowa had record rains in 2008. Texas had them in Houston and the Beaumont-Port Arthur area during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Believe me, I know that one. I flooded. So it was just an inordinate amount of rain. It was awful. We get stuff all the time, but this one was worse than anything we'd had. Midwest had record rainfalls just this past summer. And these are just some of the most recent examples, and horrible flooding happened in all of those cases. And it flooded in areas that had never flooded before. People were shocked. So we have to be aware of that. Blocked drainage can result from a lot of things. Perhaps the county's not been out and cleared out all the weeds and the junk that goes into those drainage ditches. Maybe your neighbor's dumping his leaves and grass clippings down the sewer. I once saw a couch in a drainage ditch, which would clearly get caught in the culvert that goes underneath that road when it rains. Oh, Lord, never know. Man-made events, like I mentioned, the garbage truck running over the fire hydrant or a train hitting a water tower, you know, something odd can happen. Sometimes water needs to be released from dams to prevent damage to the dam. Levees can fail, and by that I don't necessarily mean they break like they did during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, although that can happen. But levees fail when water tops over the levee or goes around the side of the levee, and that can happen. And you may have levees near you that you don't even know are there. Snow melt and ice dams can cause a lot of problems up north. As that water breaks up into large sheets, it can get caught on the bridge supports and back up the water. I mean, that was happening up by, I believe it was a Fargo and the Red River up there. My understanding is they now go out there in the spring before those sheets start to break up, and actually throw dynamite on there to break that up so it doesn't go down in big pieces and get caught on the bridge support. So a pipe or water main could break. Out west, you've got wildfires that burn off all the trees and foliage, and after that, there's nothing to stop that water from coming down the hills and mountains, and flooding's a huge problem after those wildfires. I know y'all have probably heard of disaster assistance, and you may even know somebody who received it, but there are some things you should understand about it. Many people think that if it floods where I am, it'll be so bad the federal government will come and give them money, and therefore they don't need flood insurance. Well, first of all, most types of federal disaster assistance require a declaration by the president. So if you want federal assistance, you can get state assistance if the governor declares it, but you can't get federal assistance. So if they don't declare it a disaster area, FEMA doesn't even show up and you can't even apply. Less than 50% of flooding instances are ever awarded disaster declarations. In the Houston area a few years ago, about 3 months after they finished widening Interstate 10 west to 26 lanes, we're a Jeopardy question now, by the way, widest freeway in the United States. I live about 4 miles north of there. So anyway, right after they finished that project, we had a flood. It was a really large area, covered the whole west side of town, and it never got declared a disaster area. So FEMA wasn't there, and people were scrambling to try to find funding to fix their houses because 75% of them did not have flood insurance because they weren't in high-risk areas. They didn't need it. Okay. So even if your area is declared a disaster area, one thing that many people don't know is that most typical forms of disaster assistance are loans. They're done, it's a low interest loan, about 4%, and they're done through the Small Business Administration. But it's normally set up on a 30-year term. You've got to pay it back, and you have to carry flood insurance until you do. I mean, that's a lot. So now you have 2 payments you did not anticipate. Oh, I don't know what happened there.